Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Gate Geeks. We are here for another podcast. Today, the podcast is all about calluses and blisters and callus patterns. Again, I am Scott Grimberg, joined, as always, by Ivo Werlop. Ivo, how are you?
Doing good. Enjoying the nice, sunny, cool weather out here in Colorado. We're getting frost in the mornings. So
we don't have sunny and cool today. We have humid and rainy. So that's what we are in Florida. So I'm jealous. I'm a little jealous.
You just have to move.
I do like my Florida weather overall, though. So we'll see about that.
It's pretty good.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about calluses, callus patterns, kind of what a callus is, why it happens, all the different gait type of patterning that can create calluses and blisters in certain areas. So I know this is a topic that is we like to play detective oftentimes with how people walk, and I often say like the calluses are an in-look into what's happening inside the shoe. You know, we don't have cameras inside the shoe, and calluses allow us to kind of take a peek and kind of see kind of what's happening. And what's your thought on calluses as a whole, and why they happen, and what's the importance of knowing, you know, what's going on?
You know, blisters or calluses are basically just blisters that have let themselves go, and they just go on, and we start to hyperkeratinize the outside of the tissue there. They're definitely clues to what's going on as far as mechanically with the foot. I always tell people, you know, the first thing I'm looking at with calluses and blisters is what does the footwear look like? What does the foot shape look like? And do they equal? If you take a relatively straight foot and you put it in a curved last shoe, you're asking for problems, and vice versa. If you take a curved foot and you put a straight last shoe, that's going to cause blisters and calluses in certain areas here.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and the integrity of the shoe too, right? So a shoe that's really worn, let's say the heel counter is really worn down, gives a little bit more flexibility, may allow the heel to invert or evert a little bit more than normal, which again creates that friction and creates those blisters leading into calluses.
Well, right. Or a shoe, you know, the torsional rigidity of a shoe. So if you take a shoe,
Right.
you know, figure out where the toe break is. You know, you can do that just by pushing up on the front. Grab the heel, grab the toe break, give it a twist, the twist test, and see how flexible it is. If you already have a rigid cavus foot and you stick it in a motion control shoe, you're going to create more than likely a problem. First at the foot, and then north of the foot, usually the knee, and then later the hip, and then possibly even the shoulder. As that's going on. But I've had some really good experiences with very stiff lasted shoes, and had some really nice ankle blisters to show for that, breaking in hiking boots and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So this should be pretty good. As we're going through, Scott and I called a bunch of stuff from patients and took some pictures and stuff like that. Everybody was wondering this week while I was taking off everybody's socks and taking pictures of their feet, but it was a good thing.
Typically a flat type of foot, or a planest type of foot, you'd want to put more into a stability oriented shoe to prevent some of that extra motion. And if you have a cavus foot and you're trying to get more motion out of that cavus foot, you're going to put them into a curved last type of shoe. Now, the problem with that is that motion that you're creating going to create issues in certain areas, as the foot may or may not move in conjunction with the shoe at the given spot. Have you noticed that at all in your practice?
Yeah, you have to look at how the foot is going to interact with the shoe. So where's the toe break? You know, that's where your great toe is supposed to dorsiflex in that area there. So if the toe break is fore or aft of that first MTP, that's going to either shift the foot in one direction or the other inside the shoe, which could theoretically create pressure. Also,
Right.
Is the shoe rockered? How stiff is the front of the shoe? So are you rockering over it, or are you flexing the shoe? So I think matching the shoe to the foot is super important. It could be a shoe from Walmart. It could be any brand that happens to be your pet brand that you happen to like. We could do a whole podcast just talking about shoe anatomy and
Yes.
manufacturer defects that we see frequently in shoes. It's super important to be looking for that. Certain brands are known because they're made in other countries to have really poor quality control, whereas other ones are made with much stricter standards, and your return rate is going to be a lot less. I tell you how many people have come in to see me with the problem. I look at their shoes and I'm like, where did you buy these? And I go, oh, I bought them at, fill in the running shoe store. It's like, well, you need to put them back. I put them up on the counter and I show them that the the back of the shoe. The heel counter is, canted in valgus or varus, which could be helpful or hindrance depending upon what their foot type is.
Right.
And they bring them back, and I've had the shoe store call me pissed off because, like, what are
You have to
you
return it.
shoes are wrong. They're brand new. They're out of the box. It's like, dude, stick them on the counter and like take a protractor and measure this.
Right.
It's like this shoe is in 10 degrees of valgus. Is creating medial knee pain in this patient. It's like maybe you need to take a course in like how to fit people with shoes properly. So just give them a different pair of shoes. And sometimes they'll have a bad run. So every right will be like canted that way in this certain, size lot or something like that. But don't be afraid to do that. And educating is important. But I'm divesting here and getting way off of.
We can go down a whole, like we said, we can do a whole new podcast on shoes and such. So, but they do play a role in calluses and blisters. And again, like you said, making sure that the shoe matches the foot is super important, right? And again, depending on what you're trying to do, if you're trying to control or limit some of the motion, if you're trying to facilitate motion in other area, if you want to make sure, like you said, the toe break lines up with the MTPs, all of that is super important. But let's dive into what we're looking at, and what are the real reasons why people develop these calluses and blisters.
Calluses and blisters are super simple. It's just repetitive friction, which creates shear stress. When we look at the different layers of the skin, which we'll look at in just a second, we've got a slide on that. We've got one layer of skin that has the stratum spinosum. You can see it in the right slide there. You have all these desmosomes on the outside. They're sort of like little granules of gravel, or you can think of them like a hoary frost layer, in an avalanche or something like that. And it allows friction to occur back and forth. And that occurs over time. The cells start to get disrupted in that area, creates inflammation, fills with fluid. That gives us a blister. Okay, and then the blister a lot of times will not show up immediately. It'll be quite a while before it shows up. When the blister pops, and if we continue to irritate the area, then the superficial layers of the stratum lucidum on the palms of the feet and the hands, or it could be the corneum if it's in other layers, depending upon where it is, are just going to hypertrophy. So if you were to actually do a little skin sample in your office and you look at it, that layer will be thickened with extra cells in that area. So we just get mechanical fatigue over time, and then we get repair, which is occurring. So it gives us a story. If you see a callus, the problem's been there for a while. This isn't something that just started to happen.
I agree with you 100% there. And again, blisters and calluses, they can occur in a whole host of areas, right? And there are common spots, as we're going to talk about, as to what alignment issues and what gait characteristics lead to blisters in certain areas. But just know that they can occur everywhere and anywhere. Just in your opinion, in terms of blister management, because that's obviously a hot topic, what is your go-to treatment idea with blisters? Leave them alone? Is it allow them to kind of harden? Is it to pierce them and allow some of the fluid? What's your general take home on that?
Depends upon if it's in an area which is creating problems for the patient at that moment or not, at least in our office. So we've done definitely both. Protecting that area and figuring out what's causing that extra amount of friction in that area. In this particular slide that we're looking at here, we can see that blister at that second MTP. If you look carefully, you can see that second metatarsal shaft is longer than the first. So this is a Morton's toe type foot. That means the forces come up the foot laterally, come across the med heads, and they stall at 2 rather than going all the way to 1. And then you have a tendency to externally rotate the foot and spin out, which is why they've got that little callus.
That little callus right on the top, on the
at
medial
the
hallux.
DIP, on the very, very top there. So getting back to management, moleskin works really well. Different kinds of lubricants like Aquaphor. Some people will use like petroleum-based stuff like Vaseline. Whatever. We find putting people in wool blend socks, merino wool particularly, really wicks the moisture away from the foot and has a tendency to do a little bit better. Unfortunately, once it's there, there's not really a whole lot you can do. You go through the whole shedding phase unless you shelter it, and then you get that nice raw skin underneath, which has a little bit more C fibers in there, and we get that nice pain area until it starts to keratinize and go over there. How about you?
So I agree with you. I think we do a little bit of everything. It depends how painful it is. You want to keep it at least we found, to keep that integrity as much as possible. So I don't love to rip the entire blister off. If I can pierce it with a small little hole,
Yeah.
and allow it to kind of allow the liquid out a little bit, that doesn't make it as prominent, and hopefully doesn't create as much pressure when they're walking, running, etc. Sometimes helps. I have heard people say, they want to keep it keep the integrity as much as possible without piercing it. So, we've had doctors that have kind of gone both ways on that side of it. I think the key is how irritated it is, and how their current condition lies. Like if there's somebody that's in a lot of discomfort and it's a really, angry blister, and you can see there's a lot of fluid buildup, I have found that piercing it does help some with a small little sterilized needle.
Here's something that I've never seen happen, but I'm wondering if you have. So we'll do that a lot. We'll put a small amount in, we'll take the fluid out, and then we generally try to cover that. I have never seen the skin readhere again. Have you?
No, not.
No,
No,
I've
never.
never seen that. I've seen it and then it becomes kind of hard because it's not moist anymore.
Yeah.
And then generally it falls off, but that gives the skin underneath a little bit of a protective layer. In a pinch, you're going to laugh, but with some marathons and stuff that we've worked, we've used duct tape,
Duct tape. Yeah.
and it's non friction.
Yep.
We'll either put a piece right on the undersole of the shoe, or sometimes we've put it right on the foot underneath. And the good news is duct tape has something in the adhesive that kills warts as well.
Oh,
So
really?
you're less likely to get a wart. Yeah, there was a big thing in Family Practice Journal a while ago talking about why people put duct tape on warts. And
Huh.
it's some chemical or something. Seems to work. So I don't know if that's witchcraft or whatever, but it was written up in one of the journals, and we've certainly done that before too. So
Nice. And with calluses, I think the way, I think calluses offer some protection, right? So I think calluses aren't always bad. They become problematic when they become too thickened and too large, and they become a prominence. And then that leads to excessive pressures in certain areas. So we often believe in trimming them down, but not completely cutting them off. Are you on the same philosophy as that?
yeah, we do that. We got a grinder in the back. We'll just grind them down a little bit.
Yeah, send them to go get a pedicure and then come on back, right?
Exactly. Well, we've done that before as well.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But yeah, no, definitely they can be problematic. We'll see a couple feet here where they are problematic.
Yes.
And mostly because you get that keratinized epithelium. Sometimes the edges are a little sharp. And then if that's like rubbing against another toe, then that starts to irritate that toe and we start to get a blister, that kind of stuff.
So here we're going to look at some of the common patterning that we see. The ones I typically see here, they're actually, I tend to see all of these in some way, shape, or form. I call them oftentimes the pronation calluses. And a lot of these here that we're looking at, A through F, to me are indicative of a hypermobile foot. But there are some situations where you can see it in a more supinatus or a more rigid foot. What's your thought on that, Ivo?
Yeah, I don't necessarily always put one callus pattern with a foot type,
Mm-hmm.
although I would have to say with more supinated feet, we see more stuff on the lateral aspect, particularly if that
Yep.
patient has internal tibial torsion or femoral retrotorsion where they don't, they're kind of always on the outside of that foot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, and by no means are these the only callus patterns that you will
No.
see. These are the most common ones. This is out of Michaud, one of his
Mm-hmm.
original books. Tom's a friend of ours that practices out in Massachusetts. He's got a couple different editions
Mm-hmm.
as well, but he allows us to use a lot of his artwork. But this is out of his first book,
So
looking at these common patterns. So
do you want to just go through some of these and just talk about specifically so for example, A, we see calluses underneath the second. Why would you see a callus underneath the second? And B, why would it be underneath the second and third with a pinch callus? To me, C is a very indicative supinatus foot with a plantar flex first ray.
yeah.
That's what I see with those commonly. So why don't you start with A, and we can kind of show some pictures later on to kind of really, drive this home. But, let's go through this here.
Sure. So A and B for me tend to be a combination. B, the foot type that you're seeing there is a relatively planus or flat foot
Mm-hmm.
that you're seeing with those calluses over the second and third. The
And
pinch
you would say that because of the foot shape also kind of is indicative of that.
Well, that's what I'm saying as far as
Yeah.
I think that's what Tom was trying to show
Yep.
here specifically and with that pinch callus. But you asked about
Yep.
A. Under that second, when it's just localized to only the second or between the second and the third, which we sometimes see kind of like an F as well, we'll see that with people that have either one, a lack of toe dorsiflexion in the front. So in other words, they don't have that typical 50 degrees of extension that we would like to see. Two, they have a lack of ankle rocker or hip extension where they're forcing the met heads down into the ground. A lot of times that was accompanied by sometimes stress fractures, but oftentimes forefoot pain that we'll see. Or sometimes if they have a dorsally displaced metatarsal distal ray, that doesn't allow dorsiflexion because the axis of rotation moves backwards. We also see it with a Morton's type foot where people have an elongated second met, so forces coming up the lateral side of the foot stall out at the second met, and you have increased pressure in that area. So that's kind of what we see for A.
What about a hypermobile first ray? Would you ever see it in a hypermobile first ray?
I have not seen a callus pattern like that with a hypermobile first ray, but that doesn't mean that doesn't occur. Is that when you've seen them there?
Yep. I tend to see that, and then sometimes even a little bit with D. So you get that initial pressure on the first. As it pushes out of the way, you get more of that translation, whether it be that and sometimes even to a little bit more of 2 and 3. I'll see that where it kind of gets pushed out of the way, and then 2 and 3 take the brunt, and then you get this medial whipping type of sensation with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when people have a foot that has a tendency to collapse, you're going to get kind of a smearing of the epithelium. You can see this on pedographs and stuff like that. So I would say I see that a lot in the B type foot or the A and sometimes D type foot that allows that has an excessive amount of motion, but not an excessive amount of rear foot motion. So we remember pronation can occur in the rear foot, midfoot, forefoot. So if people have mid and forefoot pronation, I think that A and D predominate. In people that have midfoot, rear foot pronation, the B pattern, along with that pinch callus, they have to somehow be able to, get to high gear push off. So they externally rotate that foot, come off the medial aspect of that, the joint between the IP and the DIP of the hallux there, and they'll have that. Although it can occur in people that have internal torsion and stuff like that, depending again upon what their pronation pattern is or what their gait pattern is, or things like that. So
I oftentimes see too with B, you'll see the pinch callus, I call it the whipping callus under the second and the third, and I'll also see sometimes an HAV, a hallux abductovalgus type of scenario where that first toe starts to creep its way over to that second toe. So I think those are oftentimes connected.
No, I think so. And again, just to reiterate what we were talking about initially is just because you see one particular foot type or pattern doesn't necessarily mean that that's the type of callus pattern that you're going to see. Or if you see this callus pattern, that's what they have. There's a lot of other factors that are going to, depend upon what's going on, the shoe, what kind of trauma they've had to the foot, what range of motion they have at each of the individual articulations. Just when you think you've got it figured out, of course, they come along another foot that's the exception to the rule that doesn't fall into that pattern there. So people with hypomobile, not hypermobile, but hypomobile first raise, we have a tendency to see more of the C pattern and the E pattern, except the foot would look different in the E pattern.
Yes, I agree with that completely. Yep.
And then just going back to what you were saying there on the B, when people do have a hypermobile midfoot and rear foot, along with that pattern, we also see lateral heel callousing because that calcaneus everts, rubs into the side of the shoe. You look in the back of the shoe and all the material's missing on the lateral aspect. A lot of times they have that little bump on the back of their calcaneus on the lateral aspect that's rubs into the shoe. And if it's been there long enough, they've actually formed bony remodeling underneath that, and they've got the deformity at the back there.
If you look in the shoe, sometimes you'll see a ripping of the material inside the shoe.
Right, that's what I was talking
personally.
about. Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. So now we have good pictures of all of these. So here's one. I'll let Ivo kind of talk about the clinical representation. There's a picture he took.
Yeah, this is just a patient. I gave some clinical information on the side, more to kind of give you an idea of like, what did this look like? What did that look like? They had hallux dorsiflexion of only 10 degrees, which is not a whole lot. They did have a forefoot varus. They had genu valgus, which was, you know, a little bit greater on one side, external tibial torsion. So it kind of gives you an idea of what their gait's going to look like moving forward. And they had a hallux abducto valgus, both sides, left greater than right. I think we have another picture of this. What we wanted to show, or just back up one real quick, Scott. If you look at that distal great toe right at that IP articulation, you can see a big callus there. You can actually see a little mushrooming of the skin on that side because this has been going on for so long. They need a way to be able to propel themselves forward. Whenever we see a hallux abducto valgus, we know pretty much automatically 99.9% of the time they've got a forefoot varus. They've got an incompetent adductor hallucis. It's doing its job. It's just it can't form that transverse and longitudinal arch. So as a result, it pulls the big toe west on the side there. And we're seeing that, and they have to peel off the inside of their foot, which is why they have that big mushroom type deformity. Interesting hallux valgus on this patient, just as far as looking at that, looking at just how it looks. Usually it's much more symmetrical and rounder. This is just at the dorsal lateral aspect of the joint. I didn't shoot x-rays on this particular person, but it was odd in that it was that. And then if you flip the slide to the next one, this just shows the patient from side to side, left versus right. You can see that part of the problem is she only has a tattoo on one foot, and that created an imbalance because the extra weight from the ink is definitely creating a problem. She's got a little bit of tibial varum and internal tibial torsion on the left-hand side. Right side's a little bit more normal. So she's going to look different left to right when you're looking at the foot and looking at callus patterns.
And looking at her arch on the left, I can't really appreciate it on the right quite as much, but she's got a good non-weight bearing arch. You know, you can see that she's definitely not a planus type of foot. Now, whether she loses that or not when she weight bears is really the question. But there's definitely the ability to, I always say the ability to house an orthotic that's going to actually support her if she wanted to, it's there.
Exactly.
Okay, so this was that like that slide, like I would say, like, was it B? Was it that we were looking at?
I think it was B, right? Yep, coming up.
Yep.
So med heads 2 and 3, this is a Morton style foot. They've got an elongated second toe as well as second met, which is going along. So the forces are going to stall off there. She does have a tiny pinch callus at the medial aspect of the DIP that she utilizes to get off. You can see that if you look at her foot, it's not a real banana-shaped cavus type foot. It's more of a neutral kind of foot, not terribly flattened. This is a gal that wears sandals 99.9% of the time. It's interesting that she's got that little split that you can see between the second and the third.
I was just going to ask you about that, because to me it looks like there's definitely a movement of her hallux towards her second, but the second doesn't follow. The second kind of stays pretty straight, and then the third moves to the fourth, and that's really where a lot of that shifting kind of occurs.
Right, and here between the third and the fourth, you got to think about callus and blistering occurring between those two toes.
Right, between the two toes, absolutely. And
in
the
that
fourth and
area
the fifth
there.
even too, even the fourth and the fifth.
Yep. And also, you'll commonly see toes coming sort of, we call it a common root, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. It doesn't come from, like, she's only got one met shaft, but they come, embryologically when they're differentiating. The two seem to come from one particular, sclerotome or portion of that somite when it was forming. So that's probably another reason that she's got that. I think also, though, because her second toe is so long, that actually afforded her some stability, which is why you're not seeing that second toe trying to go west along with the other toes.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Okay. And this is obviously a different foot.
Totally different foot. This is talking about those the calluses on med heads 1 and 5. They also have that pinch callus. So you're going to see that pinch callus on almost everyone that has to externally rotate to push forward. So when you see that, automatically they really don't have good high gear push off. And we talk about high gear push off as forces coming up the lateral side of the foot, coming across the med heads and going out through that first met. Low gear push up is, coming off before that prematurely. So we would call it toeing off in supination if you were watching a video of them walking, rather than them toeing off neutral or in slight pronation as they're coming across. So when you see that pinch callus on that distal first medially, you're always going to know that they have to externally rotate that to push out, or they've got a shoe that's really rubbing in that area there.
Mhm.
This person, I'm sorry, go
Hold,
ahead,
just
Scott.
gonna hold you 1 second. What I also want to appreciate on this foot is you can just see the different coloration from where her heel is nice and red. She's red along the lateral side. She's got a lot more, redness and wear along, her metatarsal heads all the way from 5 to 1. But her arch to me seems like it's as pristine as can be. Now, whether or not, again, that's just maybe from the picture or whatnot, but to me, she looks like the actual integrity doesn't look like she's putting a lot of pressure or has put a lot of pressure on the medial aspect of her like her navicular, her posterior tib, her medial arch. Doesn't seem like it's undertaken any stress or near amount of stress that the other part of her foot has. So if you had like a pedograph, I'm curious as to see what that would look like.
So I didn't pedograph this person, but the interesting thing, and you brought that out, is right. And she does look different left to right. She is
Mm-hmm.
short on the left-hand side. So a lot of times
Mm-hmm.
on a shorter side, anatomically, she's got a tibial deficiency. You're going to see a little bit more of a cavus foot. You're going to see the foot in a little bit more supinatus. On that side, the arch is going to look a little bit more pristine. Interestingly enough, and you can't really tell from this slide here, but she does have a forefoot varus, and she has increased when you're watching her walk. Her calcaneus eversion on the left is very, very remarkable. However, she has no printing of that medial arch because her midfoot is relatively rigid at this point. So she's got all the motion basically occurring in her rear foot. And so because her forefoot is inverted as she starts to come through gait, when she hits the ground, she's here. She has no way, she can't pronate through her subtalar articulation. So she just tips. And as she tips, her heel goes laterally into the side of the shoe there.
Mm-hmm.
This gal came in with posterior tibial tendonitis on the right side. And she's a little bit longer on that side. She's pronating through a little bit more on that side. And that's part of the reason that she had that issue there.
All right. And this is this her as
Same
well?
gal. Yep. You can see that she's got kind of a little bit of external torsion on the right-hand side, a little bit of internal on the left. Also that increased genu valgus, which is more than likely contributing to that leg length discrepancy that you're seeing on that side, just like if somebody has a flexion deformity or anything like that.
Yep, I agree.
And these are just more shots of left versus right, different angles of the left foot showing that callus on the first, because remember we're talking about the first and the fifth, as well as the fifth there.
Look at her fourth. Look at the medial aspect of her fourth toe. You can see
you can see some callusing there too.
You absolutely can, and you can kind of see the shape of it. This is what I find really interesting. It's almost like a puzzle. You look at the shape of that fourth, almost like the fat pad of her fourth, and how it kind of matches real nicely into the groove of that. I'd call it the lateral aspect of her third, and they kind of fit together like a nice puzzle. And that's where all that pressure is kind of going, creating that callus there. She's got it on the fifth too. She got it on the fifth too.
The other thing that we can see on this foot is, and you have to kind of know that you were looking for this, but as soon as I say it, everybody will say, oh yeah, of course. You can see how our fourth and fifth are trying to like crawl underneath the foot a little bit. And if you look down at her heel and you look at the lateral aspect, there's not a lot of bulk there. So her quadratus plantae is weak on this side probably because it gets the crap stretched out of it every time she steps and her calcaneus everts so much. But whenever you see a weak QP, you're almost always going to see those two toes tucking under. Remember, the quadratus plantae starts at the heel, comes forward, interdigitates with the flexor tendons as they're coming across, and takes them from the oblique angle that they're at and basically normalizes the pull so it's straight. When that's weakened, then what happens, the pull becomes oblique and it's going to pull digits 4 and 5, sometimes 3 underneath the foot. And you'll see that quite a bit. So what does that mean? They're a candidate for foot exercises, and that's all of these people here could definitely use foot exercises. And
what
I'm
foot
sure
exercise
we'll be talking
would
about
you?
that.
I was gonna say, give me one foot exercise you would target to help improve her QP.
So the one in the literature that shows the most promise for other muscles as well, but that will show QP, is called the toe spread out exercise, or what we call the lift spread reach exercise.
Is it
So
is it like
on the ground.
splaying
Yeah,
as well?
kind of. So you're standing on the ground. the base of your first, the base of your fifth, and your heel or your foot tripod on the ground. You lift the toes as high as possible. You spread them apart as far as possible. You reach forward as much as possible. You put them down flat so there's space between them. So like if you were watching the second Aliens movie and the cyborg guy took the knife and, went between the individual digits there so that you can do that. As far as they've done EMG recordings and stuff looking at that, that's one of the few exercises that will do that. The other one I imagine that would do that would be the short foot exercise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like the short foot exercise is like the grand poobah of all foot exercises, right? I think every foot strengthening program has some type of, we call it doming or short foot,
Yep.
however you want to classify it as. I group all of my foot exercise strengthening into, I call it toe yoga. Being able to short foot or dome, being able to independently lift the hallux while the other four toes are flat on the ground, and vice versa. I think I love the splaying, like you just mentioned. I love that exercise as well. So those, if I had to say, if there was any type of protocol, I'd say for my general foot population, I'd say those exercises right there is pretty much what my entire group gets.
Yeah. Depending upon, what's going on, they definitely, it'll definitely improve your intrinsic strength of
100%.
the foot. And remember, those intrinsics are going to fire basically whenever the foot, from mid stance to terminal stance pre-swing, that's when all those intrinsics are supposed to fire. It's when they fire outside of that time frame that creates an issue. But this is just the right foot. Same idea, slightly different. You can see she's got a tad more bulk on that quadratus plantae. You can see it on that left photo there on that side. She still does have that toe tucking under, so it's definitely weak. It's just not as weak as the other side.
And you can see there's actually a little bit, I appreciate a little bit more space between the third and fourth and fifth, absolutely, on that foot.
Yeah. And it's subtle stuff, but that's what we need to be looking at a lot of times. People aren't coming to see you because it's real obvious. Somebody would have figured it out already. So that's why they're probably in your office.
Very true. And then the fifth met only, I tend to see these again with a more supinated type of foot, either an uncompensated forefoot varus. I see it quite possibly there, or a rear foot varus. Do you see it tend to see it with the equinus foot as well, or do you see more calluses underneath the first with that type of foot as well?
Depends upon how mobile the first ray is and if it's in the same plane as the fifth or if it's above or below the fifth. So if they have like a dropped first that's fixed, then you're going to see it on both. On first. If they've got a first that's mobile and can get up, or a varus, then you're going to see it more on the laterally.
Yeah, I agree. And then this one speaks to the QP issue again that you were talking about. That tucked under fifth. Again, this one was actually a quite painful one. This was fairly early. I'd say it blistered. It was more callous, but it was a painful callus. And the activity that this particular person was doing was, we'll call it multi-sport in multi-shoes in environments in which the foot is probably fairly cramped as well as fairly sweaty. Doing things like running, jumping, hopping, throwing, all of that took place with this type of foot. So it's hard to say exactly, was there one particular shoe that created it? Because it's a multi-sport athlete with multiple shoes. Or was it something that, again, was slow to develop and then just kind of poked its head up and reared its head at one particular point. But I thought it was interesting to kind of appreciate the same thing Ivo talked about before, which was that tucking under and that callus on the fifth, which is, would you say this is a common one or an uncommon one?
The one that we're looking at right now?
Yeah.
Relatively common. We also see this with people that have shoes that are too narrow.
Yeah. And that fits with this.
Pushing those two toes together, looking at, like, not that I'm, endorsing any particular brand, but some of the shoes that have bigger, wider, more anatomical toe boxes, like Ultra, Topo, Keen, some of those you're going to see this less when you see more of that graduated toe box coming forward. So you see like in Nike Brooks some of those other ones. If the foot does not fit in that correctly, we see cramping of the toes. And a lot of times there's bling on the outside of the shoe, like straps or studs or, stripes or pieces of cloth or whatever that are decorative, that can press on different areas and create narrowness. We stretch shoes a lot in the office. I'm sure you do the same in your office. Sometimes it's like, well, they already got the shoes. The soles are dirty. They can't return them. So let's just mod the shoe for them so that, we can make it work and, educate them about buying something a little different next time or giving them a little bit more.
Yep. I see the cramping of the toes a lot with our spikes, our track spikes. See it a lot.
Those are like cruel shoes. Yeah.
They're like slippers. They're slippers with spikes on the bottom of them, right? So we see a lot of that we see a lot of this with that.
Oh yeah, definitely. And those are just not very good anatomical. They should just run it barefoot,
Yeah. If they could, I think they would. I think a lot of them could.
Yeah.
It would if they could.
Yeah.
I had an anecdotal story is I have a jumper that jumps obviously with shoes with spikes and then takes his spikes off as soon as he's done and relaces his shoes between each of his jumps. And I said, why are your shoes uncomfortable? He goes, no, they're comfortable for what I need to do. But as soon as I can get out of them, I want to get out of them. So, which is, I think it's healthier probably for his foot in the long run, but at the same time, you kind of wonder, is there a better way in which we can do this to make it more comfortable so we can wear it all the time? But again, that's another question for another day.
Well, it's like climbing shoes.
Yeah.
For rock climbers and stuff. Oh my gosh. Like the stuff that these people cram their feet into, you're like, are you serious? It's almost
Florida's flat. Florida's flat. We don't see any of that in Florida. It's flat.
Yeah, no, we see quite a bit of that here.
Yeah.
So this is a good one. We were talking a little bit before the pod about this particular one. What's your take just on lateral heel blisters / calluses?
We were talking. I think it could be two things. It could be the foot that excessive rear foot motion that everts the foot, drops the foot down, and creates that friction as the heel everts. Or it could be more of a supinated heel where it's very inverted, inverted, where it just rubs on that lateral column. So I think you can see it in either situation. I think the rest of the foot, which we can't really see and appreciate here, would kind of tell us the story as to what's going on.
Right. And then, remember when we're seeing friction also, we're always thinking about ankle dorsiflexion, hip extension, and just what does that look like in the shoe? And then is the upper of the shoe situated appropriately on the bottom portion of the shoe? Is it in varus? It is in valgus. Do they have excessive wear of the sole on one side that may be pushing their foot, where they literally wear their pathology into their shoe? Which we see quite a bit. Yeah.
That's a great point. I'll give you I wish I had a picture of it and I don't. It was a person that came in and they were wearing these work boots and the heel was such that the lateral aspect of the heel almost was so worn that it created a wedge. And this person, when I watched them walk with their shoes on first as they came in. This person was on the outside of his foot, like somebody that was supinating excessively, like one of the worst I've ever seen. Like literally, like the upper of the shoe was flexible enough to allow, he was almost hanging off the edge of the shoe on the lateral side. So my thought process was, wow, this guy must be really, really supinated in his gait. Well, turns out I have him take his shoes off. He's got a very flat foot. And I was very initially taken aback by that. What he had done is his foot was hitting a very lateral and then collapsing. But over time, the shoe was so old that he basically created his own wedge at the inverted aspect at initial contact, where the shoe wouldn't allow him to continue with his normal gait process. He was just walking the way the shoe was worn. And over time, it just kind of kept getting worse and worse and worse, creating almost, like I said, that lateral supinated type of posture. But when he would walk barefoot, it was the complete opposite. And that just goes to show you that shoe wear sometimes can be tricky. People, oftentimes look at shoe wear and dictate what they want to prescribe based on shoe wear. But it's just one of those things that kind of made me very, very cautious as to doing that forward. Have you seen that much?
I have. And, it's always like examine the patient, look at their shoe wear, ask a lot of questions. He just built his own orthotic. I mean, that's basically
exactly what he did. It's exactly
over time, or his body did, as far as that. And there's problems inherent with that, but there's also other problems. If it was a boot, like a work boot or a cowboy boot, chances are it had a pretty decent medial vamp, so he's getting lots of midfoot support there rather than relying on the torsional rigidity of the sole to supply that. So that could
Correct.
actually be kind of a good thing, for
Mm-hmm.
him. There's a guy that maybe, if he really likes those boots, he wants to have them resoled. They still do that. If stuff has a Norwegian welt, not a glued welt, they can still resole, the
Yes.
bottoms of them and stuff. Or if you do that, expect that you're going to create some issues in other places. Just like when you change somebody's footwear, you stick an orthotic in, all of a sudden you're changing the mechanics. And when you change
Because
that,
his upper was totally taken out of whack now because of the excessive wear that the wedge on the artificial wedge, we'll call it, on the heel created. So you put him back into a more neutral type of sole. His upper is going to push him a certain way too, which is, like you said, going to throw his whole gait out of whack.
well, that and his back and his shoulder and all sorts of other stuff that they're going to come in with. And, all
Mm-hmm.
of a sudden they're coming in with stuff that you don't think is related to their feet, but is definitely related to their feet.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
yeah,
I agree. And then this one is that center heel callus. Again, I tend to see this more with that lack of ankle dorsiflexion.
exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
not much to say there.
No, like here, although when people have a lack of ankle dorsiflexion or hip extension, along with this, a lot of times you're going to see callousing in the front portion of the foot underneath the med heads. And then depending upon the morphology of the foot, usually 2-3, sometimes 2-3-4, occasionally the medial aspect of 1 if they have to externally rotate to push off and get to high gear to be able to push themselves forward. So a lot of times, like you said at the beginning, it's a little bit of, Sherlock Holmes work. We're looking at them. It's a puzzle. We're trying to put it together. How does this fit? Why does his body say, oh, let's do it this way? Why did we build up extra material here? Um, and, thinking constantly about how that foot is going to interact um, with the shoe. Now, if you're not wearing shoes, you can still get blisters, but it's much less frequent
Mm-hmm.
as far as that happens. And it's usually if you're walking, like if you go and you walk on the beach and you haven't walked on the beach in a really long time or something like that, you can get blistering depending upon what your particular anatomy is in certain areas of your feet, just because of the friction that's going to be caused by the sand.
Mm-hmm.
But that's pretty unusual. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And again, like you said, this kind of is what we almost opened with, right? The shape of the foot and the shape
Yeah.
of the shoe, they've kind of got to match, right?
Yep. They
And
definitely
the
need to come together.
and the most important thing about a shoe is comfort, right? People always ask me what's the right shoe for me. And obviously, if somebody needs more space in the forefoot, you can recommend certain types of shoes and versus other ones that tend to be more narrow in the last. But at the end of the day, the best shoe for that person is the one that's most comfortable. But what we got to be careful about is just because a shoe is comfortable for the first 10 minutes you wear it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the right one. Like a lot of the cheaper shoes I find, you put them on for the first 10 minutes, it's like you're walking on a cloud, but it's because the material is so, I'm going to say, for lack of a better word, crappy, that over time they just bottom out and there's nothing left to them. And then they become very uncomfortable very quickly. So that's something to keep in mind too, is that a shoe that is comfortable, not just while you're in, it's got to be comfortable when you wear it in the store, but it's got to be comfortable also when you're, a week or 2 or 3 down the road. It needs to stay comfortable. It can't be one that just wears out very quickly and cause you to want to get another shoe, right off the bat.
Right.
So anything else you want to add? I think that's the last. Yeah, that was it. So again, if you want to, connect with us, we're on Instagram at The Gate Geeks, and we have a website, thegategeeks.com. We have a YouTube page, obviously. Anything else you want to talk about, Ivo, before we kind of before we get out of here?
Shameless self-promotion. If you liked what you saw today, give us a like on Instagram. Start following us. We don't post a ton, but we post a little bit here and there. We try to keep it super clinical. We're not trying to sell you, snake oil or something like that. We also have a seminar coming up in October you may want to check out. It's called From Walking to Running, the Essentials of Foot Orthotic Therapy. Scott and I use a lot of orthotics in our practices. It's basically all about gait, feet, and remediation, doing that, solving common problems, that kind of stuff. It's going to be held out here in Dillon, Colorado. Should be good. Tons and tons of hands-on, more than 50% of it. It's 20 hours of CE. If you need CE, you can go to the website and check it out. as far as if you want to register or anything like that. So.
And if you happen to stumble across this video after the conference has taken place, because this will be stored up on YouTube, which is great. We will have some on demand offerings of the course as well for you to take a look at if you're interested. So different ways in which you can view it depending on when you happen to see this video. So just head over to the YouTube, head over to thegategeeks.com, and you'll see where we are in the time frame and what we have offering at that given time.
Got it. Take care.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you.